Carl Jung documented why people with what we now call empathic abilities face a cruel psychological paradox. Their greatest gift becomes the source of their deepest pain. He discovered that empathic individuals unconsciously attract people who project their shadow onto them, people who resent the empath's emotional freedom because it reminds them of their own emotional numbness. Jung found that the more authentic and radiant someone with highly developed feeling function becomes, the more they threaten others' psychological defenses. What Jung called shadow projection creates a pattern where empaths are simultaneously sought after and secretly despised for possessing what others have lost or buried within themselves. Today, I'll reveal Jung's most disturbing discovery about empathic psychology and why he believed this pattern either destroys sensitive individuals completely or transforms them into exactly what humanity needs for its emotional evolution. The pattern that revealed Jung's most chilling insight emerged from multiple cases he observed in his clinical practice. Individuals with extraordinary empathic abilities seemed to magnetize people that would eventually turn against them with inexplicable hostility. Jung consistently documented what I call luminous emotional authenticity in these patients. They could sense others' pain instantly, respond with genuine compassion, and create safe spaces where people felt truly understood for the first time in their lives. Yet every close relationship followed the same devastating pattern. Jung's observations revealed these individuals draw others to them like moths to flame, yet these same people develop unconscious resentment toward the very qualities that initially attracted them. It is as if their light exposes shadows others cannot bear to acknowledge. People would confess their deepest secrets to them, find healing in their presence, and experience profound emotional relief. Then, without warning, they would begin to criticize them, undermine their confidence, and eventually abandon them entirely, often blaming them for being too intense or too much. Jung realized he wasn't observing simple relationship dysfunction. He was witnessing what happens when unconscious people encounter someone who has maintained connection to their authentic feeling function. The pattern Jung documented would become one of his most important insights into human psychology. Authentic emotional expression triggers unconscious shame in those who have betrayed their own emotional truth. If you've ever been criticized for being too emotional or too intense, remember this: my empathy is not too much. Others are too numb. Jung's observations of this phenomenon led him to identify what modern psychology now recognizes as psychological mirroring theory. When individuals with highly developed feeling function interact with emotionally disconnected people, they unconsciously reflect back the emotional authenticity those people have abandoned. Jung's research revealed that most people disconnect from their authentic emotions early in life as a survival mechanism. They learn to suppress sensitivity, hide vulnerability, and operate from false personas that gain social acceptance but cost them their emotional aliveness. What I call the authenticity wound shows how people who have cut themselves off from genuine feeling develop unconscious hostility toward those who haven't. The empath's natural emotional expression becomes a painful reminder of what they've lost. Jung observed that what we now call empaths fall into what I term the mirror trap. Their authentic presence automatically triggers others' repressed emotions and buried pain. This creates intense discomfort in people who have built their entire identity around emotional numbness. The person caught in this dynamic experiences what I call projection amplification. They unconsciously blame the empath for making them feel emotions they've spent years avoiding. The empath becomes responsible for pain that existed long before they entered the picture. Jung noted something even more disturbing. People often seek out those with empathic gifts specifically because their unconscious recognizes what they've lost. They're drawn to the emotional aliveness they observe, yet simultaneously resent it because it exposes their own emotional death. This creates what Jung identified as the fundamental psychological paradox affecting sensitive individuals. Jung's most disturbing discovery about empaths was how they become targets for what he extensively documented as shadow projection, where people unconsciously transfer their own rejected qualities onto the empath, then attack them for possessing these very traits. Through his analytical work, Jung found that people who resent empaths are actually resenting parts of themselves they've disowned. The empath's emotional sensitivity reminds them of their own buried sensitivity. The empath's authenticity exposes their own falsehood. What makes this particularly cruel is that empaths often possess the exact qualities these people once had but learned to suppress. Jung observed that individuals attack in the empath what they have killed within themselves. The resentment is not toward the empath, it is toward their own abandoned emotional truth. This creates what I call the innocence-punishment dynamic. People who have lost their emotional innocence through trauma or social conditioning unconsciously punish those who have managed to preserve theirs. Jung documented how this manifests in subtle but devastating ways. People will criticize empaths for being too sensitive when they themselves wish they could feel deeply again. They'll mock empathic responses as naive when they've simply become cynical to protect themselves from pain. The most insidious aspect is that these attacks often come disguised as concern or advice. You need to toughen up. The world will eat you alive. You're too trusting. These statements reveal the speaker's own emotional wounds while attempting to dim the empath's light. Jung realized this wasn't conscious malice. It was unconscious self-hatred, being projected outward onto someone who represented what they could no longer access within themselves. Through his analytical work with empaths and their relationships, Jung identified 4 distinct patterns of how people unconsciously attack empathic individuals for their authentic emotional expression. Type 1, the emotional critic. These individuals have learned to suppress their own feelings so completely that witnessing authentic emotion triggers unconscious shame about their own emotional deadness. What I call the feeling police are people who constantly tell empaths their emotions are wrong, excessive, or inappropriate. They've internalized the message that emotions are weakness and project this belief onto empaths. Type 2, the authenticity attacker. These individuals unconsciously resent empaths for being genuine because they've built their entire identity around false personas. Jung observed how people who live behind masks feel threatened by those who don't need masks to survive. What I term the performance police criticize empaths for being too real or inappropriate when they simply haven't learned to hide their authentic selves behind social facades. Type 3, the vulnerability violator. These individuals have been hurt so badly that they've closed their hearts completely, and they unconsciously punish empaths for maintaining emotional availability. What I call the trust destroyers are people who take advantage of empathic openness, then blame empaths for being too trusting, rather than acknowledging their own betrayal of that trust. Type 4, the light dimmer. The most dangerous type Jung encountered were people who systematically work to diminish empaths' confidence in their own gifts. Type 4, the light dimmer. The most dangerous type Jung encountered were people who systematically work to diminish empaths' confidence in their own gifts. They've disconnected from their own inner light so completely that others' radiance becomes unbearable. What I term the brightness reducers use subtle psychological manipulation to convince empaths that their natural empathy is a problem to be fixed, rather than a gift to be honored. Understanding your specific pattern is crucial, because each type requires different strategies for what Jung called the protection of authentic self. Jung identified 3 specific dangers that made this psychological dynamic a serious threat to both individual empaths and collective emotional evolution. Danger 1, authenticity erosion. Constant exposure to resentment and criticism causes many empaths to begin doubting their own emotional reality. They start suppressing their natural responses to fit in with people who can't tolerate authentic emotion. Jung warned, the empath who abandons their authenticity to gain acceptance loses the very quality that made them valuable. This creates what he called the dimming epidemic. Empaths hiding their light to avoid triggering others' unconscious hostility. Danger 2, psychological self-betrayal. Empaths often internalize the criticism they receive, beginning to see their empathy as a flaw rather than a gift. They start believing they're too much or too sensitive, instead of recognizing that others are often too little and too numb. The greatest tragedy occurs when the empath begins attacking their own emotional nature with the same violence others have directed toward them. Danger 3. Collective emotional stagnation. Jung found that when empaths suppress their authenticity, humanity loses its emotional pioneers, the individuals capable of modeling what healthy emotional expression looks like. Jung called this emotional evolution arrest, when society rejects its most valuable guides toward emotional aliveness. To prevent this, Jung developed what I call the authentic self-preservation protocol. Phase 1. Recognition and validation. Understand that resentment directed at you isn't personal, it's shadow projection. Phase 2. Boundary crystallization. Develop energetic boundaries to protect yourself from unconscious projections. Phase 3. Selective engagement. Choose consciously who deserves your empathic gifts. He illustrated this through figures like Saint Francis of Assisi, who maintained radical empathy despite criticism, and Vincent van Gogh, whose lack of protection led to self-destruction. Even Jung himself struggled with protecting his light in environments that feared emotional depth. Ultimately, Jung emphasized that empaths must find their tribe, fellow sensitives, emotionally evolved individuals, and conscious supporters who value authenticity. He outlined 4 stages of integration: projection immunity, boundary development, conscious community, and authentic service. Each stage allows empaths to preserve their gifts while transforming resentment into collective healing. Jung warned of pitfalls: revenge, superiority, isolation, and light dimming that could derail the empath's growth. But when integration succeeds, the empath becomes what he called a bridge between humanity's emotional past and future. The essence of Jung's discovery is this: people don't resent empaths because they're too much. They resent them because they reflect back the parts of themselves they've lost. Empaths are not broken. They are whole in a world that has normalized emotional disconnection. Your empathy isn't weakness. It's the medicine humanity needs. Protect it, preserve it, and shine it. Carl Jung documented one of the most unsettling psychological paradoxes about empaths. Their greatest gift is also the source of their deepest pain. Throughout his clinical practice, he observed that individuals with extraordinary sensitivity and authenticity attracted people who were initially drawn to their compassion, warmth, and ability to create safe spaces where emotions could be expressed freely. Yet over time, these same people who once found healing in the empath's presence would turn against them, criticizing their sensitivity, undermining their confidence, and often abandoning them altogether. Jung realized that this was not simply a matter of failed relationships, but the result of a profound psychological mechanism. Most people, he found, learn early in life to disconnect from their authentic feelings as a way of surviving in a world that rewards toughness, conformity, and emotional suppression. This creates what Jung called shadow projection. When people who have buried their own sensitivity encounter an empath who still embodies emotional truth, they unconsciously project their self-hatred outward. The empath becomes a mirror, reflecting everything they have lost, and that mirror becomes intolerable to face. What begins as admiration quickly transforms into resentment, because the empath's light exposes the shadows others cannot bear to acknowledge. In this way, empaths are paradoxically both sought after and punished for the very qualities that make them who they are. Carl Jung understood better than most that human beings rarely see each other clearly. What we perceive in another is often colored by what we refuse to acknowledge within ourselves. He called this the shadow, the collection of qualities, desires, and vulnerabilities that the conscious ego cannot or will not accept. For most people, the shadow remains buried, surfacing only in moments of projection when they suddenly despise, ridicule, or resent someone for reasons that feel overpowering, yet strangely unexplainable. Empaths, because of their openness and authenticity, are uniquely positioned to become the screen for these projections. Their sensitivity, far from being celebrated, often serves as a mirror reflecting the emotional truths others have buried so deeply that to see them again feels unbearable. The empath is thus blamed for being too much, when in reality, they are simply carrying the qualities others have disowned. This dynamic, while painful, fascinated Jung because it revealed the hidden architecture of the psyche. He noticed that those who carried the strongest hostility toward empaths were often the ones who had once possessed similar gifts. Children, for example, are naturally sensitive, receptive, and emotionally alive. They laugh and cry freely, they feel deeply, and they are easily wounded by cruelty or neglect. But as they grow, many learn that such vulnerability is dangerous. They are told to toughen up, to stop crying, to act strong. They discover that expressing emotion invites ridicule or rejection, and so they construct defenses, a persona that appears resilient, stoic, or detached. Over time, they may even forget that their original sensitivity ever existed. Yet when they meet an empath who has preserved that openness, the buried child within them stirs. They remember unconsciously what it was like to feel fully. Instead of rejoicing, however, they feel shame, anger, and resentment. The empath becomes the embodiment of a self they were forced to abandon, and so they attack the mirror rather than face the grief of their loss. Jung described this phenomenon in his work on projection, noting that we tend to see in others what we cannot face in ourselves. If a person despises weakness in others, it is often because they fear weakness within themselves. If they condemn sensitivity, it is usually because they once were sensitive but learned to associate it with pain. The difficulty, however, lay in the toll this process took on the empath, constantly absorbing projections, facing resentment, and enduring rejection could easily lead to what Jung called the danger of identification with the shadow. When an empath begins to believe the accusations thrown at them, that they are too sensitive, too weak, too naive, they internalize the very hostility that was originally projected. Their authenticity erodes, their confidence collapses, and they may begin to wear the very masks that once suffocated those around them. Jung considered this one of the gravest dangers. The empath who betrays their own nature in order to survive in a hostile environment. To illustrate this, Jung often turned to mythology. He saw in ancient stories the patterns of the psyche made visible. Consider the tale of Cassandra from Greek myth. Gifted with the ability to see the truth, Cassandra spoke with clarity about what was to come, yet she was cursed so that no one would believe her. Her gift became a torment, leaving her isolated, ridiculed, and despised. For Jung, Cassandra represented the archetypal fate of the sensitive individual, whose authenticity collides with the collective refusal to face reality. Similarly, empaths find themselves punished for revealing truths that others would rather ignore, not through prophecy, but through the honesty of their emotional presence. They feel what others suppress, and in doing so, they expose the collective wound. Jung believed that survival for such individuals required what he called the development of strong boundaries, not in the sense of building emotional walls, but in cultivating a clear sense of self that could withstand the storm of projections. Without this, empaths risk being torn apart by the unconscious forces directed at them. With it, however, they could fulfill what Jung saw as their true role: to act as mediators between the conscious and unconscious, between the lost sensitivity of childhood and the hardened personas of adulthood. In other words, empaths, when integrated and protected, could serve as bridges to humanity's emotional evolution. The danger and the promise were always intertwined. On one side lay the risk of collapse, emotional exhaustion, depression, and the gradual dimming of one's inner light. On the other side lay the possibility of transformation, the ability to remain authentic despite opposition, and to inspire others to reclaim their own buried emotions. Jung recognized that few could walk this path without falling into despair. The world, after all, is not kind to those who refuse to conform, but he also insisted that it was precisely these rare individuals who carried within them the medicine that society most desperately needed. Modern psychology continues to echo these insights. Research into highly sensitive people show that they are more susceptible to stress, more affected by criticism, and more prone to burnout. Yet the same sensitivity also makes them more creative, more empathetic, and more capable of forming deep connections. The double-edged nature of the gift remains unchanged. What Jung provided, however, was a framework to understand why this paradox exists in the first place, and how it might be transformed into a path of individuation rather than destruction. For empaths, the challenge is to recognize that the hostility they face is rarely about them. It is about the shadow of others. This recognition does not erase the pain, but it can prevent the deeper wound of self-betrayal. By seeing projection for what it is, the empath can resist the temptation to internalize the blame. Jung advised that, when confronted with criticism, one should always ask, does this truly belong to me? Or is it the reflection of someone else's unacknowledged self? This simple question can serve as a shield, allowing the empath to maintain their authenticity without being swallowed by the projections of the collective.